Good afternoon. Have we got any children? Any children in the house? No? Good. I'm allowed to be slightly rude then, because apparently this is a certificate you talk, but it's going to be quite hard to talk about our grandchildren, what's going to happen to them, without the occasional naughty word, but I'll try to be optimistic. That's going to be my aim. It's not necessarily that easy to be optimistic at the moment, but if we're thinking about being optimistic, it's worth looking back 100 years ago, because things have been this bad before and things got better before. I've got a handout for you, because you think you've come to a talk that's going to be entertaining, but I'm afraid you've come to a lecture, which you're about to see. There's going to be quite a few graphs and so on, because these things need to be shown. I don't think you'd believe some of the things I'm going to tell you unless you actually saw the numbers for yourself. In particular, the handout is some words that George Osborne decided to ad-lib at the end of his budget speech earlier this year. They're not officially part of the speech. You have to go and look at the recording of the speech to see he actually said this. And my aim of this talk is to try to get you to repeat these words to me as we're going through, because I think they help understand what's happening and part of the problem of our times. John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes, around about just under a century ago, was saying that people could be optimistic. Times were terrible in the 1920s and 1930s, but he had all these kind of theories about how things could be better. His banking friend, Oswald Fogg, said that what Keynes had really done was to help change the moral sentiment of the times. And if our grandchildren are to have better lives than our lives, are not to live with fear and anxiety and become more depressed and so on, we're going to need to change the moral sentiment in a way which is not changing enough. Now, here's your first graph, just to try to show you how we're back to those times in terms of inequality, in terms of the gaps between people. Obviously, people are much better off. Obviously, people have got more. They can buy more clothes. They tend to have central heating. You've got inside plumbing and so on. But at the same time, the gaps between us, in particular the income gap, is getting wider and wider and wider. The High Pay Commission came out yesterday, I think, saying that the average CEO of a FTSE 100 company is getting about £100,000 a week at the moment, and they're now earning 184 times the average worker in Britain. Last year they were earning 183 times. If you're being optimistic, this is really good news, because an increase of just one person's pay in a year is actually a slowdown in their take. 5 years ago they were taking 160 times the average worker's pay. It's possible, it's not impossible, that we're getting to the point of turning. The point of turning may have happened in the USA, but we're not going to get there without getting a bit angry about it. So we're going to need some anger as well as some humour. The thing that's least understood in Britain when you talk about inequality and these gaps between people is just how unusual the UK is and how it's becoming more unusual. So these are the main things I want to get over to you. This is part of a little chart that I produced in 2010, comparing the richest 25 countries in the world with at least 1 million people, and looking at how much more money the best 10%, the best of 10% had compared to the worst of 10%. Now, the money of the best of 10% is all driven by the best of 1%. The best of 1% take so much. They take 15% of all our national income. It's almost 2 national health services that they're getting every year. That their income drives up the top 10%. And of course, within the top 1%, it's the income of people in the top half and the top 10 for the top 1%, which are driving it up. There's more inequality within the 1% than there is in the other 99% of us. The 1% are not a happy group. They don't They don't celebrate CEOs earning £100,000 a week, because at the bottom of the top 1% are couples bringing in £160,000, 80,000 each. Now you may not, or you may, I often think of asking audiences to identify themselves if they're in the 1%. I won't do that. You may not have much sympathy for a couple earning £160,000 a year, but imagine if you're in London and you've just cut together and you've been working for a few years and you're doing well, and one of you's a minor banker and the other one's a young lawyer in Canary Wharf, and you want to have a kid and you want to buy a very basic 3-bed house in Fulham. Try and do that on a joint income of £160,000 a year. And so it's not possible. And part of the reason why our 1% are taking more and more and more is simply to do things like house themselves. This is the ridiculous situation we got in. Anyway, this graph, my eyesight's not good. If I stand back this far, I can actually read it. The most equal country in the rich world is Japan. The best off 10th, just best it gets, it just takes 4.5 times more than the poorest 10th. Japan is a remarkably equal country economically. Japan has fewer people earning £1 million a year, nationally about 300 people earning £1 million a year, fewer than in the headquarters of Barclays in Canary Wharf. We are ridiculous, as you're about to see. We have over 2,000 financiers earning over €1 million a year. In Europe, these are European statistics, only Europe actually collects these, we don't. In Europe, the next highest country is Germany, which has 197 bankers earning that much. We have over 2,000. So, Japan's at the bottom, then a predictable country, Sweden, Norway and Finland, and then Germany, a remarkably equitable country, despite the fact it's got the second highest number of highly paid bankers in Europe. Austria, Slovenia, South Korea, Denmark, Belgium, Switzerland. The 1% in Switzerland take half as much money as the 1% in Britain. The Swiss have a banking industry. The Swiss banking industry is very good, possibly better than our banking industry. But Swiss bankers are happy to work for half as much money as British bankers. If you carry on going up the league table, 25 countries in all, getting a little bit more unequal than Switzerland is France. But in France, the average family, the median family in France, is living off an income of 10,000 more euros a year than the median family in Britain. So when they tell you that France is an economic basket case, you have to ask why the middle family is so much better off. And that's before they even have to start to think about paying for housing. And our housing costs are much higher than housing costs in France. After France, the Netherlands. The Netherlands is, if you like, the middle country in this league table of inequality. If you were aiming for a country to emulate, it would be the Netherlands. Because if you're doing very badly, as I'm about to show you we're doing, trying to become like Scandinavia might be a bit too much. I mean, I suspect some of you have hopes of becoming like Scandinavia. You never know, you might want to create your own country and that kind of thing. But it takes a couple of generations to get there. I would aim for the Netherlands. It's not that far away either, similar place. But in the Netherlands, the boss of Royal Dutch Shell a few years ago was quoted as saying, if you paid me twice as much, I wouldn't work any harder, and if you paid me half as much, I'd work just as hard. You're beginning to get these quotes from all over Europe. You even get these quotes from some bosses in the United States. Not a single rich person in Britain, not one, has said that there's any problem with their riches. We stand out like a sore thumb internationally. Going up from the Netherlands, Ireland's slightly more unequal. Well, it was. No, but this is 2010. Then Canada, then Greece. Again, it's changed. Spain, which has changed. Italy, which has changed, as I'll show you, New Zealand. Australia, and then Israel. Pretty unequal country in Israel. Has some internal problems with its population. Doesn't tend to get on that well with everybody. But economically more unequal than Israel is the United Kingdom. That's the division between us. The best off 10 people in the United Kingdom are getting almost 14 times more than the worst off 10th of people in the UK. Above the UK, Portugal. It's no longer there. The economic crisis in Portugal has actually hit the richest the most. The poor didn't have anything to lose anyway, and so Portugal has become more equal. Then the United States. The United States is the place we keep on looking at for economic policy. Gordon Brown used to fly to the United States every summer on a holiday. Ed Balls used to go off to the United States. Why we went off to the United States to look for messages about how we should live, I don't know. But the US is more unequal than us, and finally Singapore. So if you want an idea of what a even more unequal place than the UK might be like, you have to go now to the US and Singapore. Inequality really matters. It matters for all kinds of reasons. Here's a quote from George Orwell about his shock when, for the first time, waiters looked him in the eye in 1936 in Barcelona. It hadn't happened to him before. I probably don't need to convince most of you that inequality matters. I'm stereotyping you as an audience. I suspect most of you think it does matter, but I don't know. The game I could play with you, if you don't think inequality matters, we could put all the people who don't think it matters over there, and then we could ask you to sort yourselves out by income and wealth, and talk about it and how much you're paid, and keep telling me it doesn't really matter. Just do the thought experiment yourself. I'm happy, we'll do some questions later on, so I'll leave why it matters till then. Let's have a go with a quote. I'll read you out the quote from the end of the budget. And part of the reason I thought I'd print you out the quote, we don't have to read it yet, we'll try and do it later, if you're with me. Part of the reason is David Cameron was on the Today programme a couple of days ago. Did you hear him? Yeah, a few of you. And he ended his little interview on the Today programme saying that the Conservatives were the party for the working people of Britain. That was the Prime Minister. Where he got the line from was his friend Osborne in the budget. Osborne really said this, and this is an interesting set of sentences, because each one is strictly true. It's slightly like, what's he called? Citizen Smith in 1984. You know, the man who was employed in the Tower of Statistics to produce facts which were all true, which were disingenuous. So this is what Osborne said at the end of that budget. It was the Conservatives who first protected working people in the mills. It was the Conservatives who took a great step towards state education. It was the Conservatives who introduced equal votes for women. It was the Conservatives who gave people the right to buy. So, of course, it is now the Conservatives who are transforming welfare and introducing a national living wage. And I'll get back to that later, but I do think it matters a lot. And it's very interesting and probably quite good that we possibly may get a £9 an hour living wage by 2020. But of course, for a couple currently on £8 or £9 each an hour, they're losing about £2,000 a year in tax credits as a result of that budget, so they're going to be worse off. One other thing that the Conservatives constantly say is that inequality has fallen under their watch and under the coalition government's watch. And The Economist produced an article a few weeks ago with the title Statistical Tricks about this, because it is completely true that inequality has fallen, as long as you don't take into account the best off 10%. So when David Cameron got up in Prime Minister's questions and said that inequality has fallen, he was talking about the blue line behind me, which is the ratio. This is a bit tricky, I apologise for this, but I did warn you it's a lecture. It's the ratio of the median person in the best off quintile to the median person in the worst off quintile. In other words, it's the 90th percentile person to the 10th percentile person. If you forget the poorest 10th of the population, you forget the richest 10th of the population, then the gap between those two groups has narrowed. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has looked at the Gini coefficient of inequality and said that if you ignore the best off 1%, which they have to because they're not in their surveys of data, inequality has now fallen back to where it was in 1992. All sounds fine and dandy until you include the best off 1%. And what's happened, it's happened since 2010, and it's the first time it's happened since at least 1913, is that there's been a split within the best off 10th of the population. If you're not getting 160,000 a year or more in your household, then you will, on average, have less now. You'll have less partly because there's been some pay restraint. You'll have less because one of you may have had to take a pay cut or have lost your job or lost a different part-time job. You'll have less because you no longer qualify for child benefit if you're in that group. Top 1%, most of them never bother to claim child benefit. When you're earning that much, filling in the forms is too much hassle to do. The red line shows you what's been happening if you do include people at the top. Either data statistics, they're too small for you to see here, they're very hard to do, there's some small print about it, it's just not easy, but the important thing is what happens when you compare 2010 to the latest data for 2015 and you project forwards. When you project forwards, this is what you get. And this is the scary thing. And I'm showing you all these numbers and these figures behind you to show that it's not easy. But the headline is that if things carry on as they are, then by 2030, for the richest 25 countries in the world, the United Kingdom will become the most unequal. That is where we're currently heading. The US inequality is slowing down. In some countries like the Netherlands, of course, it's much, much lower. But we're currently on track to become the most unequal, the poster boy. We're going to win the global race. But we're going to win the global race to become the most unequal country. It's based on straight line projections because we only have data for 2 points in time from the UN on these things, but that's where it puts us. It is getting worse. We are completely unusual. It is very, very strange to be living in the UK at this time. So not just historically, as I showed you at the start, it's not just that we're back to the 20s and 30s in terms of the gaps between us, but compared to other countries and compared to where we're going, this is becoming an extremely odd place. And if it happens, the best of 10th on average have 24 times more disposable income than the poorest 10th. The poorest 10th are going to food banks to get their food. There is no pleasure, there is no joy, there is no spare money for a pint of beer. The best of 10th, the question is, where is your second or third or fourth holiday? Can you afford the villa in Tuscany for 2 weeks, or are you going to go somewhere else? There's not great happiness within the best of 10th. Because all those holidays have become more expensive. You might have noticed that holidays have become more expensive. What we fail to notice is that the pound has devalued by 20%. That's why holidays became more expensive. But we've separated. Even talking about holidays is actually quite painful now. Households below average income statistics came out in June. Nobody reported what they showed. They showed a deteriorating situation. They showed how many people, children in the bottom 20% of society, can no longer go on a school trip because their mum and dad haven't got enough money for the school trip. They don't have a computer, they don't have a bicycle. They showed that almost 50% of children in Britain had no summer holiday this summer. So you're all on holiday in Edinburgh. Almost, I think it's about 45% of the children in Britain had no holiday. They might have gone to stay with Granny and Grandad, but they didn't go anywhere, not even camping, not even a £10 Butlins caravan. That's half the children of Britain this summer. And then we go up into the 10%, and the question is, can you afford to go skiing, as well as going abroad, and what are you going to do at Easter? You go into the 1%, and it's, are you going to fly off to Thailand, or maybe not Thailand, and so on. It's odd. It might feel odd, if it feels odd, you're right, because it is strange. It wasn't like this when I was a child. Things were much tighter, you lived far more similar lives, you were more likely to go to the same school as the people around you, and you were more likely to have similar holidays. It might have been camping, but I was a child, it was fun. I don't know if the parents enjoyed it so much, but the difference now is acute. And of course back then, it wasn't just in the 70s, but earlier, people got 2 weeks off from the meals. They go off to Scarborough, go off to Blackpool. We no longer have that. So it looks like a Blade Runner future, and I'm failing on my attempts to be optimistic about it. The reason to be optimistic about it is that almost nobody wins from this. Almost nobody is getting happier. And you have enormous fear at the top. I'll show you something in a minute showing the fear rising. So if you are in the top 10% of society, and if you need to know if you're in it, a household income of around about 50,000 and above will put you in it. So if one of you is earning 30,000 and the other one's on the national average wage of about 26,000, you're in the best of 10th. You probably don't feel well off. You probably think you're below average because of who you mix with, but that's where you are. You can't send half the young people of Britain to university, which is what we're doing now. The majority of young women in England go to university. You can't give them all degrees, you can't give them a freedom, you can't tell them they're clever and so on, and then say, oh, by the way, you're going to have to live a life where you're going to have less opportunities than your parents, and you're going to have to rent your entire life, because you'll never be able to buy in the south of England the way things are going. Unless people are going to be very, very stupid and will be fooled by the things they're told and by a particular description of history. So let's have a go. Let's have a go doing this. You can grab your piece of paper. If we can all start, I want you just to sort of see if we can read it out. So ignore the bit on the U rating and go straight down to the quote. So I'm going to give you a count of 1, 2, 3, and we're going to read it out, okay? 1, 2, 3. It was the Conservatives who first protected working people in the mills. It was the Conservatives who took a great step towards state education. It was the Conservatives who introduced equal votes for women. It was the Conservatives who gave people the right to buy. So, of course, it is now the Conservatives who are transforming welfare and introducing the national living wage. This is the party for working people of Britain. Thank you. We'll try it again a bit later with a bit more gusto. Anybody know what George Osborne did his degree in? History, yeah. Particular take on history. I think he believes every one of those words, and of course, each one, strictly speaking, is true. Maybe my idea of history, I've just read the wrong books though. I've got an idea who was actually on the side of the mill owners, who didn't want the Factory Act to be passed, who was reluctant for education to be spread, and when they did introduce state education, introduced it in incredibly divisive ways, dividing the gold and the silver and the bronze children up. It's what's happening amongst the elite at the top of our society is they have a particular set of beliefs. And what I've done in the book Injustice that this talk is based on is look for the evidence of their beliefs, look for what they say, pick out those kind of statements they make. Often the statements are hidden away at the end of documents because they know, partly because they have more and more people engaged in PR in their businesses, they know that it is unpalatable to tell people this, even though they believe it, but it is their belief that they come from a progressive line in history that makes things better. This is the most you can hope for, and most of you are stupid and not up to it. Only a few people are really, really able, and they need to be rewarded with salaries of 160, 200, 100,000 pounds a week, because that is what the market rate is, because the market is dividing the useless people from the very valuable people. And the useless people need to be forced to work, and they need to live in fear of not working because they're lazy, otherwise they won't work. Young people who can't find a job need a 3-week boot camp teaching them interview skills. Can you imagine a country full of young people who've all learned more and more interview skills? Is this going to create more jobs? Or is it just going to make the process of sitting there on the other side of an interview even more painful as you watch another desperate young person try their hardest to get a job when you interview 4 or 5 of them for that really crappy temporary job that you have made available for 6 months that year? Where do these beliefs come from? They come from this kind of distribution, that this is the distribution you get from international economists who measure people's educational ability. And in 2010 they used these words to describe the different children that they measured. This is actually from the Netherlands, this particular distribution. By 2015, when they updated the book, they'd taken the words off the website. But the methodology, the statistics of how people are graded was exactly the same. And if you look at the PISA numbers, in not a single PISA report by educational economists do they produce these graphs. But these are the distribution of children by ability in the OECD and in other countries. And they're bell curves. So you might think, why are they bell curves? Why do they look like bell curves? They've tested all these children and they get bell curves. It's a very simple reason why they're bell curves. When the PISA people from the OECD get the data on testing children in different countries, they adjust all the test results, they standardise them, they bring them in, they apply a correction to them, so that they all look like a bell curve. And that's the data that's given out. You don't get bell curves like this from actually testing children. It's changed. And what it says is, you have a rump of completely unable people, and then you have some sort of pretty fists dragging along the ground people, and then some slightly functional people who might be able to read and write, but not much more. And then a few people who, could be given a little bit of responsibility, but they're never going to be able to do much. You wouldn't really want them running a school or something. And then you begin to head into the area of people who are a bit special. And maybe it's their genes, maybe it's something else, maybe it's their family, maybe it's the moral scope they come from. They've worked hard and they're in near to the top group, and then you've got the top 2%, truly gifted. Which of course for people who believe this kind of thing, that's their children. And because their children are truly gifted, their children need to have a lot more money spent on their education than these other people, because this would be wasted. It would be wasted on them. So you have schools in this country where 20, 25, 30,000 pounds a year is spent on the education of the special children. And the only justification for that can be that if you can just select the right ones, either from the good breeding, and how can you tell good breeding? Well, it's good money. If you've made a lot of money, you must be clever and hard-working, and then you have your children, you can afford the school, and so on. And so we have this division. There is only one country in the OECD which is more divided when it comes to educational spending. That's Chile. Chile's a remarkably divided country. There's nowhere else in Europe. Even in the United States, there are fewer private schools. But it's normal, and we're in Edinburgh, and Edinburgh is absolutely full of this kind of division. And that kind of thing becomes normal, that kind of thinking. In the average OECD country, how do they do educational spending? They spend slightly more on children who are a bit slower at school, because those children need a bit more spent on them. This is normal in a normal country, but we're not a normal country. We're a country in which the divides between households are getting wider and wider and wider. People rotate around this particular graph. As your income rises, you do better, you move up, you might even get a mortgage as long as it's not London in the southeast, where the houses are being bought by landlords now, not by people. Your wealth increases, but then something goes wrong. What normally goes wrong is you lose your job, you get ill, or you split up. Those three things. And you spiral your way down, and you can move into different social groups. And this is petrifying. This is frightening. If you ask an average middle class audience in this country how much money you get on job seekers' allowance a day, they will not know. And the reason they will not know is because it's not a safety net for you. You do not think, oh, if I lose my job or all goes wrong and I'm on my own, I'm an armed state, because you know that the amount of money is too small for you to actually be able to stay socially with the group that you were in anymore. It's about £10 a day for your food, for your soap, for your bus tickets, for everything else you might need. And it creates this enormous fear, this enormous fright amongst the population. And because the distribution goes like this, because you start off, I'm going to start in the middle, forget the bottom 50% of society, start in the middle at 26,000. Then you move over here, 40% of the population, to about 40 or 50,000 pounds. Then you move here to 99, you're on 160,000. Then you move halfway through the top 1%, and you're on 300,000 pounds. The higher up you get, the better you do, the further you move, the farther down it is to fall. If you look down, you get vertigo. So you have to protect your children, you have to increase their chances, because it's hard to imagine what's going to happen. And what happens in this kind of situation? These little dots are each studies, and they're studies of depression clinically measured amongst 15-year-old girls. The size of the dot is the size of the study. How high up the dot is the proportion from a representative sample of the population who are found to be depressed, and along the bottom is time. And you can see this data actually comes from North America. You can see the rising anxiety amongst 15-year-old girls in particular. It comes from an academic paper that was produced to say there was no increase. And the academic paper said there was no increase because it included studies from Japan and the rest of Europe, where there isn't an increase in anxiety amongst 15-year-old girls. But you take out North America, we don't have enough studies in Britain to do it, and you see that increase is there. Or, go to Scotland, and have a look at the proportion of the population of Scotland who are now taking Prozac and its equivalents. When I first did this, my data went up to 2005-06, and it appeared to be slowing down to over a tenth of the population. So it's roughly 1 in 10 people are taking pills to take themselves away from themselves in Scotland. And then, of course, since the recession, it's gone up higher. This isn't normal. And the degree to which people are taking these things varies between countries. Mental health is, if you like, the biggest worry about inequality. A quarter of people in the United States now have a mental health problem. It is much, much lower in more equal countries. Being positive. And again, these are just correlations. Of course, they don't mean that one thing causes the other. But you also don't get correlations simply by chance like this. What this one is showing you is a series of countries. The x-axis is how much the 1% take, and the y-axis is the proportion of people who walk or cycle to work. And so at the bottom, we've got the United States. Just 3% of people walk or cycle to work. And way up at the top, you've got the Netherlands, and it's 50% of people walk or cycle to work. Now, it's not that the population wake up in the Netherlands and go, hey, we're a pretty equal country, our 1% don't take that much, let's get on the bike. What happens, I think, is that in a more equal country or more equal society, it is much easier to do things like plan your housing system so that houses cost a similar amount of money, rents are reasonable, you can choose where you want to live, so people can live near where they work so they can walk or cycle to work. In a more equal country, it's possible to get government money to build railways that work and have buses that work. In a more unequal country, taxation is seen as bad, inefficient. You just want people to look after themselves and their family, which means everybody having a car and driving yourself everywhere. And the result of that in the United States and other countries which have a low proportion of people walking and cycling to work is that people get fatter. So there's an even stronger correlation between obesity and inequality. Because one of the fastest ways to get fat is to sit in a car for 3 hours a day. The only exercise you get is on that bit of your foot. Right? It's just not, it's not high enough. But the positive thing here is to forget about the United States and the United Kingdom. Look at more equal countries. Look what they do. Look how people perform in them. So, how could things get better? What could happen for our grandchildren would be better? If we reject this, if we say we really don't want to live in a society which is the most unequal of the 25 richest countries on the planet, What do we want? What do we want it to be like? And I think this is where the left has failed the most. Because what the left tends to do is to look back to its achievements in the past, things it did which were very good in the past, for instance, getting everybody into the same school, and say we want that again. Or it looks back at things like building council estates and says, yes, we want those again. What the left in the United Kingdom no longer does much of, although the Scottish government is beginning to do more of it, is to suggest different ways in which things might be better in the future. Do we really want our grandchildren to go forward 100 years' time? Do we want them being tested at school every year? Do we want what's about to happen this September? All children going into state schools in England this September are going to be assessed within the first 4 or 5 weeks to work out their baseline ability. And then targets will be put on what they can be expected to achieve at GCSE. Say a C. So you get a 5-year-old, see how well they can do, then you produce a target, and then schools are told to value add up to that ability. It is madness. And a lot of you don't even go to school till you're 6. I suggest that if you step back and think about all these unborn people to come, you want them to have a much more relaxed environment. You want them to have one in which they're not all being graded and sorted. It would be quite nice if they could go to school, if we still have schools, with everybody else around them, so that when you come home from school you can play with kids that you were at school with from the street. And this may sound fanciful, but one wonderful thing of being one of the most unequal countries in Europe is all we have to do if we want to have utopian ideas about how the future could be is just go over the channel and have a look at them. You can go to Finland, 99% state education, and see what the Finnish school is. And you might be slightly shocked to see that children don't wear shoes, they're all in their socks in Finland, and they sit around on beanbags and end up doing very, very well and get into university and being highly able and literate as a group. Not by sorting out the individual supposed golden children amongst the Finns and educating them, but by treating everybody as all having the ability to do things. There will always be a tiny number, it's about 2% of people, who will have a mental disadvantage, which means they won't do very well at education. And there'll always be a tiny number, I suspect about 1% of people, who are genetically extremely odd and can multiply very long numbers in their heads and do other very weird things. But short of those extremes, the rest of us are remarkably similar. We're remarkably similar because we evolved to be similar. We all evolved to have binocular vision. We all evolved to have an opposable thumb. And every time we create another human being, we mix a set of genes together in such a way that very little is hereditable. It's all just a jumble up. Which is why you vary if you've got siblings. How many people have got siblings in the audience? Put your hands up. Good. That won't be the case in 100 years' time, by the way, if you look at what's happening to population. If you've got siblings, the reason why you vary so much from your sibling, and you are so different, is because you've got a different mixture, apart from all the rest of the things. Let's stop showing you lots of graphs. I just entered this one on voting, and then there we'll ask you to tell me where I'm going wrong. And I'm sure some of you think I'm completely mad about this, and my views of things. But I do think where we are lacking as compared to 100 years ago. 100 years ago, things were very, very tricky. There was about to be a revolution in Russia. That really scared 1%. Part of the reason things got better was the revolution in Russia. There was about to be a world war. There was an economic crash. There was a general strike. There was mass unemployment. But at the same time, there were people producing pamphlets saying things like, why don't we get our doctors together in groups so they can have a health practice so that you didn't have to work on your own. People were producing ideas about how schools could work. People were producing different models for the future, and we don't have that now. This last graph is, again, about the Conservative Party. So I'll explain the graph, and then I'm going to get you to read this out one more time about George Osborne, and then we'll do some questions. What this is the segregation index of the Conservative Party. at each general election since 1980. So it's not how many votes they got, it's not how well they did. It's how many Conservatives you'd have to move around the UK with a magic political butter knife if you were to get an even spread of Conservatives on your kind of toast. Okay, that's my best attempt to explain it. And you can tell I'm slightly strange, this is the kind of thing I calculate. But these are the same segregation indices that are used to say, are Muslims moving away from Britain, are we living parallel lives, and so on. And if you work out these segregation indices, of course, the groups who are becoming more segregated are the rich, the middle, and the poor. They're the ones who are moving apart from each other, not people by ethnicity or religion. So this is a segregation index for Conservative voters. It was very high in 1918, it came down dramatically in the 1920s. There was particular Conservative voting linked to being Protestant in particular parts of Liverpool, Glasgow and so on. All that begins to disappear. By the 1950s and 60s and 70s, Conservative voters are spread out all across the country, which is hard to imagine, but there were lots here. Now it's completely different, as you can see where the graph is going. So you can walk out to an Oxfordshire village and you'll just know how people vote because you can see data. And of course, to Scotland, you could do a very funny game of Hunt the Tory in Scotland and so see if you can find them. It's never been harder to find them because there's never been fewer voters. So it goes around the bottom in the 1960s and 70s. And then the key thing is October 1974, the second election in 1974, and you get a little jump. And that jump was people in the southeast of England, a year after the miners' strike in 1973, were just fed up. They were fed up with blackouts, they were fed up with the unions being powerful, and they voted Conservative. Big swings to the Conservatives in October 1974. Didn't matter, Labour still won, but it happened a year before Margaret Thatcher came to power. It was a sign that the country was changing. Margaret Thatcher gets into power in 1979, and then in every election since 1979, the Conservative vote becomes more and more segregated. This is bad news for Conservatives, because you don't want your vote to become more and more concentrated. It's good to have a little concentrated. That's the Green Party's problem. There are Greens everywhere, but just not enough in certain places. But it becomes more and more concentrated. So that by 2010, the Conservatives can't win an election on their own. They have to form a coalition with Liberals. But then the most remarkable thing happens, and this is what's happened in the last bit of the graph. You get a huge jump in the index. It exceeds 1918. Tories have never been more clustered. It's like the kind of, the wagons have been brought round and they're really sheltering in parts of England. So the question is, how can they be that segregated and win the general election? So here's my little explanation to end on, and then we will read George Osborne's words. Part of what happened in the last election, it wasn't Scotland. The last few elections, Scotland is not influencing it at all, because apart from a little rump of a few Conservative voters in Scotland, they all stopped voting several elections ago, Tories. So this has got nothing to do with Scotland. What happened is that people in the southwest of England, in areas which have become more affluent, became more Conservative. Places like Oxford East became more Labour. The area I now live in has got 50% Labour vote for the whole constituency. London became more Labour. More people have become unregistered from voting at any time since the poll tax. So there's lots of people not voting. But then of the electorate, of everybody who was able to vote in the election, only 25% voted Conservative. I think, and I'm saying this at various talks until somebody contradicts me, that in no other election in the last 100 years across the whole of the planet has 25% of people managed to get a majority of government in. The lowest proportions I can find anywhere in the United States, where half of the electorate don't vote, but the president still needs 26 or 27% to win, and the other one gets 23 or 24%. Just 25% of people voted Conservative. It just happened in an incredibly fortuitous way, and I think partly out of luck. I honestly don't think they thought they were going to win it. But the important message from that is that when people tell you that they're in for several elections and that they're solid and they're safe, you just have to remember it's only 1 in 4 of the electorate. Another reason, of course, is that a third of the electorate didn't vote, because they just had enough of all the parties, and they're just sitting there. Another reason is that UKIP vote was just enough to hurt Labour with some marginals there. Another reason was the complete collapse of the Liberal Party, because of what they'd done it. But only 1 in 4 people who've had a vote voted Conservative. So let's just read out one more time, then we'll do some questions with more gusto. Because you're going to be getting this for the next 4 years. And I think we have to, rather than sit there quietly, I think we have to give it back to them. So let's start. It was the Conservatives who first protected working people in the mills. It was the Conservatives who took a great step towards state education. It was the Conservatives who introduced equal vote for women. It was the Conservatives who gave people the right to buy. So, of course, it is now the Conservatives who are transforming welfare and introducing a national living wage. This is the party for the working people of Britain. Thank you very much. I think we've got a couple of mics if we're lucky. So a chance of having the mics up a little bit. Who wants to tell me I'm completely wrong or ask me what I think about something that I've avoided talking about deliberately? Because I find it tricky to answer. Somebody over here?
I was just wondering, kind of, the graph to do with inequality and walking or cycling to work, that the 3 countries lowest down with the worst rate of taking, like, of walking or cycling to work were 3 of the largest countries in the world. So they were Canada, the USA and Australia, so do you not think it's actually more to do with living in a big country means you live further apart, so public transport is harder to organise?
Because it can't work. So the question is partly the lowest rates is in some of the largest landmass countries, like Australia and the US, so that you can't do this. It does matter a little bit, but if you take Australia and think of somewhere like Melbourne, the tragedy of Melbourne is that people who emigrated into Melbourne wanted the Southern English dream, which is a half-acre or an acre plot. So you get your acre plot, you put your detached house on it, the next person gets their acre plot, puts a detached house. Before you know it, you're 25 miles out from the centre of Melbourne. Just because Australia is a big landmass doesn't mean that that was a sensible way to build Melbourne. If you want a brilliant example of a country with a very large area for its population, which doesn't do this, it's Scotland. Scotland has very dense population in particular cities, which means that Scotland can be arranged with a public transport system, which means it doesn't need to have as many cars. But you've got to point to it. But do you want people spread out this much, or do you want them in settlements where they're near enough to each other so that they can simply go to work or go to school without requiring a car? It's a ton of glass and steel. That's essentially what these things are. And the most common way in which everybody in this country dies between the age of about 4 and about 24 now is by being hit by a car. So these aren't necessarily good things. If you're thinking about how to improve life in Edinburgh, it's not bad already, but you know, a little bit more space for the cycle lanes, a bit less space for the cars. So now I think Edinburgh's now 20 miles an hour, right? In some places, okay, the whole city hasn't gone. Okay. It tends to always be the posh places that get 20 miles an hour first. Yeah, so Oxford's got 20 miles an hour. And partly, I mean, I want to partly use the snobbery of this. You know, sort of say, if you want your town to look good, you want 20 miles an hour. And slow the cars down, and then it makes sense for people to live nearer. Once you've got people walking and cycling more, they mix more. They mix more partly because you don't want to cycle the extra 3 or 4 miles every day simply so that your children go to that slightly better school. It's only slightly better because you're sending your children there. Essentially, everyone is better. They also mix more because they look each other in the eye on pavements and on bikes. But you have a good point about that. There is a related graph, which I have far too many graphs. I obviously have a problem, which is flying. And people in more equal countries tend to fly much less. So in Germany they use the trains. People in more unequal countries tend to fly more, but the exceptions are places like Ireland and Canada and Norway, which is a very equal country, but it really is a bit bumpy.
Thanks very much, Dan. I thought that was fascinating. You mentioned two very basic things, like education in Finland. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. You know, when you say that these results offer public education. You look at housing in Holland, again, it just seems like common sense. You know, and you'd think, you know, all that information would be available, people would know it. Of course, the grand narrative we have in this country is, if you attack that 1%, it's the envy, it's the politics of greed. Now, I mean, I have my own opinions about how that comes about, but what you say about that concentration of the Tory vote, I think is very, very interesting and very, very encouraging too, because it makes it feel that, you know, they are not certain to win, that they must be vulnerable. And I thought intelligent Tories, you know, would be worried about Corbyn, and obviously, you know, the Tories are encouraged by Brown and Blair and that usual gang of right-wingers. But how do you think we've been able to perform this massive con-trick against common sense?
They don't think it's a con-trick. They generally believe their beliefs. This is why I've got you to read out what Osborne said twice. It's not a set of lizard people sitting there trying to fool the population. They've grown up in an environment that's been so sheltered. You know, first of all, Daddy's a stockbroker in terms of Cameron. You have nice summer holidays or whatever, but they send you off to boarding school, which is a bit brutal. But you're told that this is a very good and privileged education, and you're so privileged to be allowed to wear that silly uniform. And then you get into Oxford, and you don't see many people who are poor, except for a few beggars on the streets. Your idea of poverty is that's what poverty is, because you never cross over the bridge and go into East Oxford. You then go and get the job. Well, somebody phoned up and got a job for him in Carlton TV. £90,000 starting salary. You get the job, it's easy to get a job, so of course anybody can get a job if they just try hard enough. You socially mix with everybody who agrees with you. So you're not being contradicted except by a few mad people. And so when I first contradicted, the standard thing I would get was, he's only a professor at Sheffield. Of course he'd say that, but he's not a professor from where we went to university. So one of my little reasons for taking the job at Oxford. They genuinely believe they're doing public service. They're also making sacrifices, because they could be earning a lot more money in the city, but they're sacrificing their income and their wealth for the good of us all, because we are not up to understanding it. And when things are presented to them differently, they say, well, my set of friends, well, we all got 3 A's, we must all be very clever, and they all agree with us. And I think it's not a contrary, they believe it, and that makes it a really persuasive argument when Cameron, I think, honestly believes, when he said on the Today programme, I think it was Saturday, I forgot when he said, we are the party of working people, I actually think somebody had told him that they were, and he believed it.
Well, how do you think then, Dan, as a supplementary question, that their version from that tiny percentage of very rich, privileged people, and I've met people like that who are absolutely convinced, I've had that argument with them, how do you think their narrative becomes the dominant narrative?
You can look to the United States, where it became not dominant narrative slightly earlier, and part of it, what Ronald Reagan did, was constantly talk about black welfare queens. You demonise people below. You tell people if only you work hard enough you can make it. You're still a kind of an American dream. There's been surveys across countries of how many people think their children will be rich. And in the US, people are most likely to say, I think it might be at least a quarter of the population in the US think their children will be in the 1%. And it correlates with numeracy. The most important thing about the 1% is you're always going to have one. It will always be exactly 1% in size. A quarter of people can't be in it. Countries which organise themselves well control their 1%, the 1% will contain a disproportionate number of extremely greedy and selfish people. It always will. But sometimes we lose how to control them.
A lot of what is driving your argument is about segregation and selection, and I think that's right. I think it's very persuasive. I guess I'm thinking about people of younger generations will be socialising a lot on the internet, social media, and I guess a risk there is people then segregate themselves. You end up having discussions not with people you've bumped into, but people you've selected. And I wonder if that makes you optimistic or pessimistic about whether we're going to break the elite narrative that you've been talking about and start to have a better discussion.
Yeah, it's the worry that people will be able to divide themselves more in cyberspace than in real space, and so it could get even worse. But they are dividing in real space. I saw it with one of my kids. I mean, one thing that makes moving from Sheffield to Oxford easier is that boys that are around about the age of 11 now play games with their friends with a headset on, and they're all killing somebody together on the screen, and they're not going around each other's houses. So the only good thing about this, I'm slightly worried why we're teaching them all how to kill, is if you take a boy and move him from Sheffield to Oxford, he can carry on killing people with his friends in Sheffield. And then even his new friends in Oxford can join in and do this, but of course, it's a particular social class of friends. There haven't been enough studies, to see whether it's increasing. We're teaching our children that they have particular values, that we're testing them and ranking them, giving them numbers. They know if they're a 6C, a 5, well maybe not in Scotland. Do you do this?
Moons and stars and rainbows, they all know exactly what it means.
They know what numbers they've got, yeah. And then, currently in England, clearing's on. There's a free-for-all now. Any university can take any numbers of students. So we have clearing and adjustment. You can now reject your offers if you accept it and go upwards. 50% of people going to university. There's not much else to do if you're 17 or 18. It's part of the problem. Surprisingly, all these universities are telling them how wonderful they are, because of course in England they get £9,000 every year for them. There are a whole series of universities which have now started interviewing students. Why are they interviewing large numbers? Is it to select the best? They tell them they're all wonderful in interview because they want to get them in, but they're giving young people the message that you are all different, we need to grade you, this is where you get. Where it ends is at 21. Because what happens to children from Russell Group universities in England at 21 is a large number of them are unemployed for 3 months. Then eventually they get that call centre job with their 2-1. And there's this horrible process of realisation, and it begins with thinking that they individually are no good. They didn't work hard enough. If only they got the first, if only they got a different degree or whatever. But after 3, 4, or 5 months, because they're connected on Facebook to all their friends, they can see it's happening to all of them. Then you get some solidarity over, in fact, all those jobs we were promised. Okay, we've got a job because you're a graduate, but it's a crap job, it's temporary, and you have problems paying your rent, and you can never get to the point of stability. And part of what happens then in England is this massive movement of graduates to London. So every year since 1971, more and more graduates have moved to London. A high proportion have moved to London, even as we put more and more people for universities. So like 90% of new full-time jobs in England were in London the last couple of years. And it's the only place you can go. And then in London, they're paying almost all their wage on their rent. And again, if they compare themselves with their friends, they find that's normal. They are not a failure. It is a system which is failing them. So I'm optimistic it could be good, because there isn't a group nowadays really of successful young people. The successful young people are organising things like the Intergenerational Foundation and Priced Out to complain about house prices and the fact they can never get a mortgage. It's now a privilege to be allowed to borrow a huge amount of money to buy a house. And as they become slightly less young, they want to have a family, and that's becoming harder and harder to do. The student debt, they pay back at 3% above inflation. The Secretary of State in England can change it at any point. The student who gets an average job, £26,000 a year, will be paying back £56,000 on the 27,000 they borrowed. This is before the changes that came in that made it worse in the budget. If you get a good job, say a £38,000 a year job, a bit higher, you pay back £156,000 for the privilege of having borrowed that money to go to university in England. Then there's a small group, and I think this was where the anger might become worse, whose parents paid 9,000, so they don't have that debt. But even that group is getting angry about the situation they're finding themselves in, because their parents live in big houses, ones that they can never afford to buy, because there are really rich immigrants coming in who are buying in those parts of London.